The courtroom was so cold that morning I could see my own breath hanging in the air, and for a moment, I wondered if the chill was coming from the ancient air conditioning system or from the sheer dread sitting in my chest like a stone. I was 28 years old, completely broke, and about to lose the last physical piece of my father I had left in this world. 10 feet away from me sat my Uncle Richard, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, whispering something to his attorney that made them both smirk in my direction. I had no lawyer. I had no money. All I had was a manila folder full of memories and a stubborn refusal to walk away quietly. Then the bailiff called our case. The room fell into a silence so total I could hear my own heartbeat, and Judge Evelyn Carter looked up from her papers. She didn't glance at my uncle. She didn't acknowledge his high-priced attorney. She looked directly at me, adjusted her glasses, leaned forward over the bench, and asked a question that changed the entire trajectory of my life. "You don't remember me, do you?" My name is Claire Morgan. This is the story of the worst year of my life, and the single morning that redeemed it. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, I need you to understand who I was before I walked through those doors. Because the woman who stood there clutching a worn folder was not someone who had ever expected to be fighting for her own home in a court of law. I spent 4 years in the military. I won't bore you with every detail, but I will tell you that the discipline I learned there, the ability to stay calm when everything around me was falling apart, the ability to keep my spine straight even when my knees wanted to buckle, was the only thing that got me through what came next. I learned how to function on no sleep, how to keep moving through freezing conditions, how to follow through on a mission even when every instinct told me to quit. Nothing in that training, though, prepared me for betrayal wearing a familiar face. When my service ended, I came home to Sacramento to help take care of my father, Daniel Morgan. He was, in every sense that mattered, my entire world. He raised me alone after my mother passed away when I was young, working 6 days a week as a mechanic out of a small garage 2 blocks from our house, coming home every night with grease under his fingernails and a tired smile that never once wavered when he saw me. He taught me how to change a tire before I could parallel park. He taught me that your word was worth more than any contract, that a handshake still meant something if you were the kind of person who kept it. He was honest to a fault, meticulous about every dollar, the kind of man who would drive across town to return an extra $5 a customer had accidentally overpaid him. When he died of a sudden heart attack, the floor of my entire existence gave way beneath me. One moment I had a father, a home, a plan for my future. The next, I had a funeral to plan and a grief so heavy I could barely stand upright in the shower each morning. And before the flowers on his grave had even begun to wilt, my Uncle Richard appeared at our door like a vulture that had been circling long before the body was cold. I remember the exact moment the nightmare began. It was 4 days after the funeral. I was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes full of sympathy cards I hadn't been able to bring myself to read, breathing in the last traces of my father's scent from an old leather jacket draped over the armchair, when I heard the knock. Richard didn't come in with a casserole dish or a hug or even a simple, "How are you holding up?" He came in holding a manila envelope, and there was something in his eyes I had never seen before, something cold, calculating, already victorious. He sat across from me at our old kitchen table, the same table where my father had helped me with algebra homework and taught me how to properly season a pot of chili, and he laid out a stack of documents that looked like they'd been crumpled, smoothed out, and crumpled again. According to Richard, my father had signed over the deed to our 2-story Craftsman house 2 years earlier, in exchange for $40,000 in cash, supposedly to pay off old debts. He claimed my father had been drowning in borrowed money and had quietly sold our home right out from under me, telling no one, not even his own daughter. I knew my father. I knew him the way you know the sound of your own front door closing, the way you know which stair in your house creaks. He was proud. He was careful with money to the point of stubbornness. He would never have taken a loan he couldn't pay back within the week, let alone secretly sold the roof over his daughter's head without saying a single word about it. The idea was not just false. It was an insult to everything he had ever stood for. When I told Richard I wasn't packing a single box, wasn't handing over a single key, the pleasant mask he'd been wearing slipped completely off his face. Gone was the uncle who used to bring me birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside. In his place was someone I barely recognized, someone who leaned across that same kitchen table and told me, in a voice low enough to feel like a threat, that if I made this difficult, he would drag my name through every court in the county, destroy my credit, and have me removed from the property in handcuffs if it came to that. He gave me a choice: walk away quietly with nothing, or fight and lose everything anyway, humiliated and homeless in the process. I chose to fight. I didn't know yet how outmatched I would be. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life, and that is saying something for a woman who had already survived deployments and a father's funeral within the same handful of years. I called every legal aid office in Sacramento County. Most were backlogged for months. The ones that weren't wanted retainer fees I simply did not have, not after funeral costs and the medical bills that had piled up in my father's final weeks. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I treated it like a mission. I spent my nights at the kitchen table, the same one Richard had sat at with his forged papers, surrounded by every document I could find. Old utility bills in my father's name going back 15 years. His original mortgage paperwork, which I found in a fireproof lockbox in his closet, still bearing his signature from the day he'd bought the house. Tax records. A journal he'd kept, half business ledger and half diary, where he recorded every major expense and decision of his adult life. Nowhere in 15 years of meticulous records was there a single mention of a $40,000 payment from Richard, or any debt large enough to justify signing away the only home he'd ever owned. I read through California property law until the words blurred in front of me. I learned what a quiet title action was. I learned what a notary's commission meant and how to check whether one was valid. I did not know it yet, but that last piece of self-taught knowledge would matter more than anything else I had assembled. Still, when the court date arrived, I walked into that courthouse alone, without a single legal credential to my name, carrying nothing but a worn folder and the unshakable conviction that my father had never lied to me in his life. The Sacramento County Courthouse on the morning of my hearing felt like a building designed to remind you exactly how small you are. High ceilings, cold marble, the particular hush of a place where people's entire lives get decided by the hour. I sat on a hard wooden bench outside Department 4 for 45 minutes before our case was called, watching Richard and his attorney, a sharply dressed man named Roger Sterling, murmur to each other with the easy confidence of men who had already won. Sterling had the look of a lawyer who billed by the 6-minute increment and had never once lost sleep over a client's guilt. He didn't glance at me, not once. To him, I imagine, I was barely worth the effort of eye contact. A grieving, unrepresented 28-year-old was nothing more than a minor scheduling inconvenience standing between him and lunch. Case number 408, Morgan versus Morgan, the bailiff announced, and his voice seemed to bounce off every wall in the room. I stood, squared my shoulders the way I had been trained to do 1,000 times before, and walked to the defendant's table with my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone in the gallery could hear it. Sterling rose smoothly, buttoned his jacket, and approached the podium like a man about to accept an award he'd already been promised. "Your Honor," he began, his tone rich with practiced authority, "we are here on a straightforward petition to quiet title and to enforce an expedited eviction order. My client, Richard Morgan, holds a valid, executed agreement transferring full ownership of the residential property on Oak Ridge Drive. The defendant, despite repeated formal notices, refuses to vacate the premises and is currently trespassing on real estate that does not belong to her." He placed a thick stack of documents on the clerk's desk with theatrical precision: supposed payment ledgers, a notarized deed, and a signed affidavit from a woman named Margaret Lewis, who claimed to have personally witnessed my father sign away our home. Behind me, I could hear Richard settle back into his chair, crossing one leg over the other, utterly certain that this hearing was already decided in his favor. Without a lawyer standing beside me, he was banking on the assumption that no one would bother scrutinizing his paper trail closely enough to find the cracks. He had, as far as he was concerned, calculated every detail. He expected Judge Carter to glance over the paperwork, stamp the eviction order, and send me out onto the street before noon. Judge Evelyn Carter leaned over the bench, her sharp gaze moving across the eviction motion with the unhurried focus of someone who had seen every trick a courtroom could offer. She turned the pages slowly, the sound of rustling paper the only noise in a room otherwise holding its breath. Sterling stood at ease near his briefcase, the posture of a man expecting nothing but a formality. Then Judge Carter stopped. Her hand hovered over one page. Her eyes moved to the defendant's information, line by line. Claire Morgan, daughter of Daniel Morgan, late of Sacramento County. She lowered her reading glasses slightly and lifted her gaze, and this time it wasn't aimed at the attorneys at all. It was aimed directly at me. Something in the room shifted instantly. I felt it before I understood it, a change in pressure, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Richard's confident posture faltered just slightly, though I doubt anyone but me was watching him closely enough to notice. "Ms. Morgan," Judge Carter said, her voice carrying a quiet, resonant authority that silenced the entire gallery. "Please step forward to the podium." My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but I made myself walk, gripping the edge of the wood to hide the fact that my hands were shaking. "Yes, Your Honor." She didn't look down at the legal brief in front of her. She studied my face instead, the way you might study an old photograph, searching for something buried decades deep. "You don't remember me, do you?" The question hung in the frozen air of that courtroom like something suspended mid-fall. Sterling blinked, glancing between the bench and me, clearly thrown off the rhythm of a hearing he had expected to sail through. Richard sat up straight, his relaxed posture gone in an instant. "I am sorry, Your Honor," I stammered, my pulse pounding against my ribs. "I don't believe we've ever met." Judge Carter let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and then she said the words that would unravel everything Richard and his attorney had built. 12 years ago, Route 50, near Tahoe, during that catastrophic November blizzard, an overturned sedan sinking into the shoulder of a ditch, a mechanic who pulled over in the middle of a whiteout with a frightened 16-year-old girl riding beside him in his tow truck. The memory hit me like a physical wave, so sudden and so complete that for a moment I forgot I was standing in a courtroom at all. I was back in the passenger seat of my father's old flatbed tow truck, 12 years old, watching snow come down so thick the headlights barely cut through it. I remembered the flashing amber beacon on the roof of his truck, reflecting off the ice-slicked highway, and the way he had pulled over without a second's hesitation, the moment he spotted a car half buried in a snowbank on the shoulder. Every tow company in the region had already shut down for the night because of black ice warnings. Judge Carter's voice, steady but heavy with old emotion, filled in the rest of the story I hadn't known I was part of. My mother had a broken collarbone. Hypothermia was already setting in. Emergency services were still 20 minutes out, if they could even reach us at all. Your father spent 45 minutes in sub-zero wind, cutting through a jammed door frame with hand tools, pulling us free just minutes before an electrical fire started in the dashboard. He wrapped us both in blankets from his own truck and drove us straight to the nearest clinic himself, rather than wait for an ambulance that might never have come in time. She reached into a drawer beneath the bench and withdrew a small, worn leather notebook. From between its pages, she slid out an old Polaroid photograph, holding it toward herself for a long moment before turning it to face me. When my mother tried to give him every dollar in her wallet, along with a ring she was wearing, your father refused. He told her, "Save your money, take care of your family. Kindness isn't for sale." Before he drove away that night, he handed us this picture of his daughter in her high school track uniform. He told us, with more pride than I have ever heard in a stranger's voice, that you were going to do great things with your life. She set the photograph down gently on the bench, as if it were something fragile. "I never forgot that face, Ms. Morgan, and I never forgot your father's integrity." For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath along with me. Then Sterling cleared his throat, stepping forward to try to seize back control of a hearing that was slipping rapidly out of his hands. "Your Honor, while that is certainly a moving story, it has no bearing on the executed conveyance before this court today. The contract is unambiguous, signed and properly witnessed by Ms. Margaret Lewis. Personal history, however sentimental, cannot override binding califer. NIA property statutes." Judge Carter's expression settled into something calm, precise, almost dangerously composed. "You are entirely correct, counselor," she said. "The law governs this courtroom, and we are going to follow it to the very letter." She picked up the thick stack of documents Sterling had submitted and began turning through them with a slow, deliberate precision that made my chest tighten with something between hope and fear. She stopped on the deed itself. "Let us examine your client's evidence under the strictest scrutiny this court can offer, starting with this purported deed of transfer, dated March 14th of 2 years ago." She tapped a pen against the notary seal at the bottom of the page. The notary stamp on this document belongs to a Thomas Bell, whose official commission was formally revoked by the Secretary of State 4 months prior to the date on this instrument. A ripple of shock moved through the gallery. Sterling's confident posture cracked visibly. Furthermore, Judge Carter continued, flipping to the property description. "The parcel description on this deed references a municipal tax reclassification that did not take legal effect until 6 months after this document was allegedly drafted and signed. In other words, counselor, this deed describes a version of the property that, according to the county's own records, did not officially exist on the date it claims to have been executed." The color drained visibly from Sterling's face. Behind me, I heard Richard's chair creak as his knuckles turned white against the armrests, his earlier smirk collapsing into something closer to panic. "This is not merely a flawed contract, counselor," Judge Carter said, her voice dropping into a register that carried the full weight of the law behind it. "This is an amateurish fabrication, presented to this court in bad faith, in an apparent attempt to defraud a grieving heir of her deceased father's estate. Did you genuinely believe an unrepresented defendant would lack the resources to expose such a brazen scheme? Did you believe this bench would simply rubber stamp what amounts to grand theft, dressed up in the language of a civil filing?" The gavel came down with a crack that made both Sterling and Richard flinch in their seats. "I am referring this entire file, along with the fraudulent statements attributed to Thomas Bell and Margaret Lewis, to the district attorney's office for an immediate criminal investigation," Judge Carter declared. "The petition for eviction is hereby dismissed with prejudice. Clear title to the property on Oak Ridge Drive remains, and has always remained, solely and unquestionably with Claire Morgan." She turned her gaze towards Sterling, whose earlier composure had entirely evaporated. "Mr. Sterling, you will be facing an immediate inquiry before the State Bar's Ethics Committee regarding your role in presenting fraudulent evidence to this court." Then finally, she looked past him to my uncle. "Mr. Richard Morgan, you are remanded into custody, pending formal felony indictment." 2 bailiffs stepped forward and closed handcuffs around Richard's wrists. The man who had walked into that courtroom expecting to strip me of everything I had left in the world was led out through a side door, pale, trembling, and utterly unrecognizable from the smug figure who had smirked at me from across the aisle less than an hour earlier. As the gallery slowly emptied, and the room returned to its ordinary hum of shuffling papers and quiet conversation, Judge Carter caught my eye one final time. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She simply offered a small, knowing nod, the kind exchanged between 2 people who both understood exactly what had just happened and why. It would be easy to call what happened in that courtroom luck, or coincidence, or even favoritism. But it wasn't any of those things, and I think Judge Carter would have said the same. It was the simple, quiet consequence of who my father had chosen to be on a freezing mountain road 12 years before I ever needed anyone to remember it. He had helped 2 strangers on the worst night of their lives, asking for nothing in return, not even a name. He had planted a seed of decency into the world, without a single thought of what it might one day grow into. More than a decade later, when I stood alone and outmatched, surrounded by people who assumed my grief made me an easy target, that same seed of kindness rose up to shield his daughter when she needed it most. I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon and drove straight home, back to the house on Oak Ridge Drive, back to the porch where my father used to sit every evening with a cup of coffee, watching the street go quiet as the sun went down. I stood on that porch for a long time, feeling the weight that had been sitting on my chest for months finally begin to lift. The house was safe. My father's name, and everything he had ever stood for, remained exactly as intact as it had always been. His legacy of quiet, unglamorous decency was still alive, carried forward in the daughter he had raised to fight for what was right, even when she had to do it completely alone. I think about that night on Route 50 often now, a night I barely remembered living through, a night that turned out to be the very thing that saved me 12 years later. I think about how many small, unnoticed acts of kindness are happening around us every single day, each one a seed planted without any promise of ever seeing it bloom. So I'll ask you the same question I've asked myself every day since that morning in Department 4. What would you have done, standing alone in that courtroom, with nothing but a folder of memories and a father's example to hold onto? And have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness circle back, years later, to save someone who needed it most? If this story moved you, let me know where in the world you're reading or watching from. I'd love to see just how far my father's example has managed to travel.